Hello and good morning and welcome to another OAuth Happy Hour. I'm Aaron Parecki here with Micah Silverman.
Hello.
How is everybody doing today? Go ahead and drop something in chat if you are here. Let me know where you're joining from. Sure, we got people from all over the place today, so it's always fun. We've got a fun agenda on the schedule today. Going to share some updates from from the last OAuth meeting, and going to go through some new developments elsewhere in the world of OAuth, and possibly even talk about some security concepts. So should be fun. Um, yeah. So what's been going on your side of the world in OAuth, Micah?
Trying to get rid of pixelation on my camera. Well, that has nothing to do with OAuth. But yeah, I've been having some fun this week. I imagined up an architecture for demonstrating authorization code injection exploit, which we can look at a little later. And kind of accidentally discovered that Google has a new consent flow, which I think is kind of interesting and worth talking about. Pros and cons, user experience versus security. We can take a look at that too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, awesome. Um, cool. We got some people joining from. We've got Sean from Ireland. We've got Sharon from Finland. Good morning, welcome. Or I guess evening there. Naresh from India, and Deepak from Florida. Thank you all so much for joining. Paul from Washington as well. That's just north of where I'm at, from Portland. Yeah, that's a people all over the place. I guess it's pretty late over in Europe right now, so hopefully this isn't too bad of a time for you all. Well, let's jump right into it. So I'll share some updates from the last OAuth meeting. So for some context, normally the OAuth group meets in person I think, times a year, three or four, and they're like it's the meeting. It's an IETF meeting, so there's a whole bunch of working groups that all meet during the same time, and it's like a week full of meetings, and each group will get like 2 or 3 sessions to work within themselves, and people are often part of multiple groups. And obviously, since nobody is traveling anymore, the last in-person meeting was turned into a virtual event, and most of the event was just the sort of like formal IETF things that the sort of administration organizes, but all the groups themselves were free to organize meetings on their own schedule, because otherwise it would have been just too much to try to still pack in a week of everybody meeting from different time zones. So the OAuth group decided to turn their what would have been 2 days or 3 days into a series of weekly meetings over 6 weeks, which turned into then 7 weeks. So we're coming up at the end of that now. This was going to be the last meeting, and then there was some lively discussion the week before about a new draft, and we needed to schedule some more time. So there's one last one on the agenda next week. This week's agenda was actually 2 relatively new drafts that were being introduced. One of them is one that I was working on, and I was originally on the agenda for November and then got bumped because we ran out of time. So let me go ahead and share this tab. So this was the agenda, and we had 2 new drafts to talk about: reciprocal OAuth and client intermediary metadata. So reciprocal OAuth is the idea that it was written by someone who had this problem specifically at Amazon, making the Alexa device. So the idea is that if you have an Alexa hardware and you want to connect it to like a smart speaker like Sonos, you need to do you do the OAuth flow, which gives one of those an access token for the other's API, and that's fine for like if you just want to be able to use your Alexa device to tell Sonos what to play. But often what was happening was it would need to work the other way around as well. So you would want to like connect your accounts, and they would actually both then want to be able to make API calls to each other. And the process of doing the OAuth flow, you would have to actually go through the OAuth flow twice, once from each side. So you would first do the Alexa to Sonos flow, then you do the Sonos to Alexa flow. And I just realized I'm saying Alexa a lot. I hope I'm not like causing everybody's speakers to go off.
Triggering everybody's echoes around the world.
Yep, sorry. But so doing the flow twice would be kind of annoying. So the idea is with reciprocal OAuth to have it be one flow from the user's point of view, and it ends up with both having an access token for each other. So it's a cool idea. I think it's definitely like solves a specific problem. So this was proposed. This was brought up during the call, and the outcome was sort of everyone understood the problem and understood the benefit of this, but nobody really felt like they had a pressing need themselves to go and implement it. So the official result on that was not going to do anything with it anymore. So until someone has until somebody has like a pressing need for it in their own API, this is sort of on hold, on the back burner. So the other one is then a new one that I was bringing up, which is called client intermediary metadata, and this is actually an interesting one, also solving a particular problem in the banking world. And this spec itself is not terribly interesting, but what's more interesting is the actual problem it's solving. So I have to share a different window. I just realized I should have done that differently. Let me go share the other window, which has the slides I presented. And this is what I was actually presenting during the meeting. But the idea here is that when you go and connect an account via OAuth that's like your financial institution, you're going to see a screen like this. This is focused around this consent screen. So normally you'd have like a client ID identifying this app. So this is like this budgeting app wants access to your bank account so that it can pull out the transactions and show you graphs or whatever, which normally is fine. But in reality, that's not how banks work. Normally there's actually like these different aggregator companies that actually manage data, pulling data from the API and giving it to these applications. So you're probably familiar with some brands like this, where you have banks over here, you've got your applications like Mint over on the other side, but those applications don't actually talk directly to banking APIs. They always go through this middle layer of aggregators. And in the OAuth world, it's not quite set up to actually make this happen in a way where you can show the intermediaries on this screen. So the spec is really just meant to fill in that gap of allowing the consent screen allowing things to have enough information so that the consent screen can actually show those intermediaries who are actually moving the data around.
And Aaron, when the bank example, that's kind of a primary use case, but it's a general spec for metadata to use on consent screens in whatever way makes sense. It's not just for banks, right?
Yeah, exactly. So this is being driven by this use case which was brought to me, and there was originally a proposal for a much more specific like financial institution way of doing it, and I wanted to make sure that it was actually applicable to anything. So I was trying to boil it down to what is the actual underlying, what are the underlying concepts here, and I pulled out that concept of the intermediary, and that's what the spec is that I proposed is doing. It's just adding that intermediary data about that processor into the consent screen. So you could use it for anything. So, you could imagine that there's, I'm sure, healthcare use cases, right, where there's a lot of different people involved in moving data around in the health industry. Anytime that there's anybody beyond just the sort of end user application and the API, if there's things in between that you need, where you need the user to agree that they might also get access to that data, that's what this is for.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So that one was, we had a pretty good discussion about it. A lot of people understood the problem and you have this problem in their own work. I'm not saying that this proposal specifically is the right solution to it. I was more trying to just bring up the concept that this concept of the intermediary is missing in OAuth, and just enough to be able to say, get the OAuth group to understand that this needs to be added to OAuth. Otherwise, people will be doing this themselves some other way, where every industry then solves it on their own in some non-standard way. So we would rather have that sort of concept underlying OAuth in the core specs, so that everybody can, build stuff using the same models and same security models and things like that. So
yeah,
we didn't quite end up with enough time to have a good resolution on that. But the next step is to talk about this on the mailing list, because there was definitely a good amount of support for some sort of solution to this kind of thing.
Yeah. And anything that gets the banks especially away from collecting, I guess these third-party apps from collecting our bank credentials is good. Mint, and you need a budget to get them away from that old school password anti-pattern. So anything that contributes to them going that direction would be very good.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because right now what's happening is the intermediaries are the ones that actually make the calls to the banks. So the application like Mint will ask the user to enter their password, collect their password, send it to the intermediary, which then has to store it, and then goes and makes API calls at the bank. Now, it's not just that anybody can't just become an intermediary. You have to go through tons of contracts, which is why they exist, because the apps don't want to go through that process. So there's that middle layer that does that service. And there's a huge amount of burden of getting certified and able to actually do that, which is why I'm sure it seems like it's okay to collect the user's password, because everybody trusts everybody in that situation, right? The contract's a mile deep, but it's definitely not an ideal situation. And we should not be training users to just hand over your bank account login to random apps. So we really need an OAuth solution for that.
I forget which one it was, but one of them was sophisticated enough that that they were even asking for your one-time passcode shared passphrase, so that it could, put in
so they could generate
so that they could generate the code every 30 seconds and not only authenticate as you, but satisfy the second factor. So it's going further down the road of this anti-pattern.
That's really bad. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
taking a step back, Aaron, I was just curious. I attended 2 of the 7 so far. Now there's going to be an 8th. And I had 2 questions. What's happening beyond that? And how do you think it worked from your perspective, having attended all of them, to have it be remote? Not like we have much of a choice right now, but I was just curious how it worked from your perspective.
Yeah, so this is not the first remote meeting that the group has had. This was we've had interim meetings, is what they're called, remotely between the 3 per year, and I will say that I think one of the benefits of doing the official IETF meeting as the sort of 7 weeks in a row was that we did end up with more total time, because we would have been limited to about, I think it was 5 hours total scheduled in person, of a 2-hour and a 3-hour session. There's often breakout meetings that get scheduled that are like side meetings, which is really nice. So we didn't get that because there's no side to meet on. Actually, it's not entirely true. I did have some breakout meetings with the other authors of the OAuth 2.1 spec, usually immediately following the call, because we were all already there. But that's a lot more like, it's a lot more work to schedule that kind of stuff when it's asynchronous like this. So yeah, there's definitely benefits to the in-person meetings where you get the hallway track and you get to talk with people unofficially, not just during the booked meeting times. But I do think it actually worked pretty well having the official meeting times be virtual, because we could spread it out better and we didn't have to feel like we didn't have to cram everything into just the 3-hour slot, which is a lot. It's really hard to manage that agenda because it's very easy for discussions to run over. So when it's all spread out where it's 1 hour chunks at a time, at the end of the hour, like everyone's got other meetings to go to. So it just gets cut off. Everybody pretty much agreed that 1 hour was too little, and we're going to probably bump it to 90 minutes going forward, because this is probably happening for the next meeting as well in, what is it? I think it's August or something. It worked out okay.
And there was also some discussion of maybe limiting the number of topics per meeting as well, right?
Right. Yeah. So for this one, we had 2 topics per meeting, and I think that was also a challenge because it meant that one of them always had to end at some arbitrary time to make sure that there was at least enough time for the other topic, and we never really know which one's going to have more discussion. So we're going to try to just do 1 topic per meeting next time.
That makes sense.
Yeah. And then, so we'll see how it goes. As far as next steps now, the discussions now continue on the mailing list. So this was meant to be a way to like gauge general sense of who's interested in what, which it did do a good job of filtering out like what are the high priority topics, what are the ones that nobody cares about. So this discussion now continues on the list until the next round of what would have been in person, but will now be virtual meetings. Yep.
Cool.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that's about it from the recap of the meeting. Other sort of OAuth group news, the discussion from the last meeting has continued on the list about OAuth 2.1 in terms of how to deal with the Pixie question. Pixie versus, like, should Pixie be required and in what way should it be required? Whether authorization servers should forcibly reject non-Pixie requests, things like that. That discussion has mostly come to a conclusion after a lot of very long emails and conversations. And we're still teasing out the exact wording, but the idea is that we do want to make sure that other extensions can extend OAuth still, like OpenID Connect. And we don't want to necessarily say that what they're doing is now wrong, as long as they are plugging all of the security holes that exist without doing Pixie. So we also don't want to have the OAuth group like certify or stamp their approval on an extension that hasn't gone through the vetting process of the OAuth group, of the IETF, right? So we don't want to necessarily say OpenID Connect is fine because OpenID Connect has not gone through the security audit of the OAuth of the IETF. It's its own group, and I don't think they've actually done a security audit, but that's a different story. But you know, it's if you believe it is safe, then you are free to do that. But we don't want to have the IETF OAuth spec endorse it.
Yeah.
It's a tricky subject, especially because there's a lot of overlapping people in both groups, and obviously they're often used in parallel. So it's tricky to make sure that that's all stacked up the right way.
Right, and there are some vested interests along the way.
For sure. Yeah.
It looked like the way it was leaning was this notion of saying that Pixie was a must unless you have some other extension or mitigation for the problems that you encounter without Pixie. Is that a accurate?
Yeah, I think so. And now I need to actually go and double check the specific wording on that, because there's two sections in the spec that talk about it. So it was 4.1, the authorization code grant, and it says that the I'm looking at the old version. That's why. Well, we can come back to that.
Yeah, I just remember there was some combination of like must with unless to make it not like written in stone for those implementers or organizations that weren't using Pixie but had some other mitigation in place. But we can get back to the specifics. And for people who are just joining that aren't aware of this, the idea is that Pixie mitigates some common issues for confidential clients, as well as for things like spa and mobile apps. And so there's been this pretty lively debate and discussion about having OAuth 2.1 kind of mandate that you use Pixie in all contexts. And it's kind of a good tie-in to this little project that I started noodling about over the last couple of weeks about how to demonstrate a code injection attack which affects even confidential clients and would be mitigated by Pixie. So I could share my screen just to take a look at, and you'll have to forgive my terrible diagramming. This may be a little hard to look at here, but the idea is on an attacker's computer, there's a browser extension that's doing a couple of things. One is that it's getting an authorization code every few minutes, because authorization codes time out. I know with Okta it's 5 minutes, but every few minutes it's going and grabbing a new authorization code from a legitimate authorization server like Google. And then it's taking that authorization code and syncing it up with some central attack server. In the meantime, you've tricked some unsuspecting end user to install a malicious browser extension that they think is, doing something legitimate, but it's going and retrieving these authorization codes, and it's injecting them. It's listening for and injecting them into authorization responses also from Google. And so when an authorization response comes back from Google that includes a code for this target user, the malicious browser extension could swap in that code, and then whatever legitimate service this target user is interacting with, now they end up in a state where they're logged in as the attacker's user. Now, why might that be useful? Well, maybe this is some site that goes and, for whatever legitimate reason, collects a credit card or collects personal information. This user might go ahead and update their information, but now that is being associated with the attacker's account. So maybe I'm getting some personal information about this user, or maybe now this user's credit card information is now on file with this legitimate service, and now I can go over to it and start buying stuff. So this is just kind of a first pass at an architecture for this, and I'm actually working on building it. I've written a couple of browser extensions already, and I'm not going to publish it anywhere, but I am going to use it for demonstration purposes to show this code injection attack. And the idea is that this legitimate website here is a confidential client, and this code injection attack will work with the standard authorization code flow, but would be mitigated by authorization code plus Pixie. It wouldn't work in that case. So just this lively debate kind of put the idea in my head, and hopefully it'll help forward the conversation, because I think it's a natural question. Like, we have a client secret. What do we need Pixie for in a confidential client? Hopefully this will answer that question.
Yeah, this is definitely a tricky one, because it's not the normal, what you would think of as like a normal OAuth attack where you're trying to like break into somebody else's account. The client secret solves that already, right? Like if you're trying to break into somebody's account, if you can steal an authorization code for their account and then redeem it, you could break into their account. But that's not the attack we're talking about here, because that's solved by, earlier with earlier parts of the spec. The problem we're talking about now is actually trying to get someone to log in as you, which sounds like not useful, but yeah, like you're saying, well, what if they then enter a credit card into your account? Or maybe it's like they upload a file. Maybe it's like a document signing service, and now they've just uploaded a contract or a bank statement or something into now the attacker's account. There's plenty of different ways that could be a problem, so we need to make sure that's solved as well. And it turns out that Pixie is a solution to that. So this attack is called the authorization code injection attack. And if you read the security best current practice as well as the OAuth 2.1 draft, authorization code injection is mentioned several times in the draft. So Pixie is a solution. Another solution, at least in theory, is using the OpenID Connect nonce parameter. And that's because it's similar to Pixie, where the client makes something up at the beginning, which isn't ever actually sent, or can't be like tricked into changing that value. So the client makes up the value, and then it gets included back in the access token, or in the Pixie case, it's used to get the access token. And that way, the client knows that like it's not just sort of randomly getting this data from somebody else's account. So, but Pixie, if you're not doing OpenID Connect, then you have to solve this with Pixie, right? So you might as well just always solve it with Pixie, so you don't have to think about it.
Yeah. So it looks like there's a couple of questions related directly to that. So in this case, the ID token returned by will have the attacker's info rather than the legitimate user. Yeah. So there may be some risk here for the attacker. They'd probably be using a dummy account that they didn't care about, because now this other user is essentially logged in as them. So you probably, if you're targeting like an individual, you might have to set things like the name correctly, or whatever, so that you didn't raise suspicion. But yes, they're logged in as the attacker. But now in whatever way they interact with the site, it's all being bound to, the attacker's account potentially.
Yeah, and it's more than just the ID token. So the ID token is one part, but it's the access token that really makes this a problem. Because the access token can and you can go actually make API requests in the attacker's account, like uploading files or setting a credit card.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I'll keep you posted on progress with my demo. I'm sure it'll be a YouTube video at some point.
Yeah. Cool. I'm looking through any other questions that are relevant to that.
Here's another one. For standard web apps or SPA or mobile apps, is authorization code flow plus Pixie the most secure flow? For mobile apps, it's been around for a while, and it's kind of a requirement to secure them at all. It's more recent for SPA apps, but it's, as a general purpose approach, it's definitely makes it more secure. It's much more secure than the old school implicit flow for SPA, and that's essentially why that has been deprecated in favor of Pixie, because now between libraries and browser technology, you can use Pixie for SPA apps. That wasn't always the case, but now it can only improve whatever the context. It will only be improved by using Pixie. So, we kind of recommend using it everywhere, including confidential clients. There are some benefits there. Anything you want to add to that, Aaron?
No, I think that's it. Yeah, so Pixie solving two different attacks, actually probably more than two. But the important part to remember is that it is solving multiple problems, some of which are solved by other methods, depending on the circumstances, depending on like client, whether you have a client secret, for example. So it's just sort of easier to say that Pixie is part of OAuth and everybody just use it for everything, because then you don't have to wonder, like, is this specific case covered by it or not? And what do I need to be doing instead? So that's sort of why we're recommending that Pixie is just everywhere by default. It's just part of OAuth 2.1. And if you really know what you're doing and you want to extend OAuth 2.1 in a way different from Pixie, then you're on your own. Good luck. But if you need to, some people want to make sure that there's still that hook available to extend. But yeah, like it's looking like Pixie will just sort of become a part of OAuth 2.1 so that it is just how it works. This question, so I've been following the development of Pixie since last year, but most services that opt for APIs don't seem to support it. Why is that, and do you think it will change anytime soon? I suspect the reason why, well, first of all, there are lots of services that do support Pixie, especially the big, like the major players like Google, Amazon, like all the big identity providers. What you might be seeing is if some services only support confidential clients, like if they don't ever have any mobile apps or single page apps that are doing, that are being built, then they if that service was built to only support confidential clients like web apps, they may have never bothered building in Pixie support because it wasn't recommended for confidential clients until about, roughly a year ago. So that's probably the reason. If the service does support mobile apps, then the other way that the service would have been doing that was the implicit flow, which hasn't been recommended for mobile apps for a long time, but for single page apps, it was still recommended, even though it has a lot of problems. So follow-up question, for mobile apps, it's a requirement for making them secure at all, which was, I think, what you said, Micah. So what do you do if the service doesn't support Pixie? Tell the service to support Pixie, because that's the only way to do it. The problem is that without Pixie, mobile apps and mobile apps can't use a client secret. And without either of those, without both of those, you have all of the problems. So like both authorization code injection, like we were talking about before, like Micah's demo, but also stealing authorization codes is now like very possible. So, and specifically on mobile, it's a problem. It's even more of a problem because of the way that redirect URIs work. So with the web, at least there's like HTTPS and the browser will check the certificate, and like that's probably going to be fine. That's probably enough protection. It's not 100%, but it's probably enough. On mobile, you don't even get that because any app can just claim URLs. And it's a lot more likely that an attacker can sit on the redirect URL of a legitimate app and steal authorization codes. So yeah, what do you do if the service doesn't support Pixie? Change services, use a different OAuth server. If it's a product that you're buying, for example, or a library, or like an open source project, file an issue with them, tell them to support Pixie for mobile apps, because they really should be doing that.
And one thing I want to add is, what adds to the confusion, I think, is that there are providers that absolutely do support Pixie, but they also still support implicit. Okta is one of those providers, Google also. And so, when I demonstrate the implicit flow detector, I go to Medium, and Medium, when you log in with Google, you can see that it's using the implicit flow. Well, on the one hand, we could kind of blame Google for still having the implicit flow supported. But on the other hand, Medium could update their site and use the Pixie flow. So it's kind of a hard balance. Like Okta and Google and other providers, they don't want to break their existing customers' sites by all of a sudden flipping the switch on the implicit flow. But it is there as an alternative. So, we're just trying to spread the word and to have applications use best practices. So, Okta and Google and others are going to support implicit flow. Hopefully, not for too much longer, but it is still officially part of the spec. So, we're trying not to break people's stuff and at the same time trying to get them to engage in best practices. So as a developer, you might make the assumption, well, Google supports the implicit flow, so I guess I have to use that. But they also support Pixie, as does Okta and others. So if you want to just double check and make sure that, you may find that Pixie is actually available. It's just not in widespread use yet, even though it's available.
Yeah. Here's another question following on. Would it make sense to, so this is in the context of if a service doesn't support Pixie, like if you've confirmed that it does not, then would it make sense to build a wrapper around that and handle it in your own backend? So I guess I would say if this is an API that you have to use because of whatever reason, like it's, I don't know, Instagram or something, and you just have to use it in a mobile app and they don't support Pixie, then you could build your own OAuth server out in front of it and basically turn your mobile app into a client of your own like proxy thingy, which is then a confidential client to this OAuth server. That way you don't need Pixie because it's, well, you still have the potential for the authorization code injection attack without Pixie in confidential clients. So you've only plugged up half of the problem. But that would be probably better than trying to somehow do the OAuth flow with the service directly from the mobile app, because if it doesn't support Pixie, it probably also requires a client secret. And you can't really ship a client secret in the mobile app. So that would be worse, like to do that. But that's a tricky situation. So I'm not sure that I would recommend that. But if you absolutely have to, then yeah. And that's one of the things that it's one of the things that Okta is actually good at, right? Which is Okta can be I sync out with other third-party identity providers. So you can use Okta as your way that you want to get people to sign in with Google, right? You don't have to implement sign in with Google directly. So instead, you can just interface with Okta, which then is basically that little wrapper around Google's OAuth server.
Yep.
Yep. So here's another question. Is it possible to update any client using the implicit to auth code by giving it a backend and assigning it a session ID, scalability notwithstanding? Kind of. So actually one of the recommendations in the best practice document for browser-based apps is to do that, where you move the OAuth exchange into a server-side backend, so that you can use a client secret or whatever it is, and then you do use a session ID to the browser, and that will then basically it removes OAuth from the browser, right? Like from the JavaScript. So it moves it into a server-side backend where it's a little bit easier to do it safely.
And as a general approach, if you have that option, like it's always better to not have your mobile or spa apps have tokens if that is a possibility for the architecture of your app. So when I sit with clients at Okta sometimes, and they're talking about building spa apps and using Implicit or Pixie, I'll ask them, well, do you have middleware? Do you have like a .NET or a Spring Boot app? And if they do, oftentimes it works just to use the regular authorization code flow, with or without Pixie. With Pixie is better, but either way, then their spa app or their mobile app never sees tokens at all, and you kind of rely on the middleware to do all the heavy lifting and store those tokens safely and use them when needed to interact with APIs, and they just kind of ferry information back down to the spa app or the mobile app. That's kind of the best security footing to be on if those apps don't have to have tokens of their own.
Yep. Cool. Well, I think that's a pretty good discussion on that. Should we move on to the other topic we want to talk about, Google's consent flow?
Yeah, sure. I'll share my screen again. So this is something that I kind of happened on almost accidentally. I was using draw.io this week to put together my terrible diagram for my code injection attack, and I noticed that Google now has adopted a new consent flow, new to me. It may have been around a little while, but it's the first time I saw it. And if you've been working with OAuth and or OpenID Connect, you've encountered consent screens of varying quality over the years, I'm sure. But generally speaking, they kind of follow a similar sort of flow where you see a consent screen that enumerates everything you're giving consent to, and then you give it kind of a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Some of them, like Facebook, have gotten a little more sophisticated where you can check and uncheck. But what Google did that was interesting is they kind of lead you through step by step, and they have a different unique screen for each consent item that you're giving. So for instance, here's where I started out for draw.io, authorize, sure. It's Google, so I could have a number of Google accounts. Here's where I would choose the Google account I wanted to use. But then it showed me this next screen, which I thought was interesting. So it wants, draw.io wants the permission to add itself to Google Drive. It shows me that it's one of two, and it gives me this summary, add itself to Google Drive, but it's got a little down arrow. And if I click on that down arrow, it expands to give me some more information about this particular permission, and I can deny or allow. Whether I deny or allow, it then leads me on to the next one, which is 2 of 2. And now it says Draw.io wants permission to view and manage Google Drive files and folders that you have opened or created with this app. And again, if I choose to click the down arrow, it gives me some more information about that. I choose allow or deny. Whether I choose allow or deny, I then get to this kind of final confirmation screen. And this is like the more traditional screen that we've probably all seen, where it reiterates those permissions that I was giving. So there's one that's absolutely required, which is grayed out, see your personal info. And then there's those two that I saw individually, and I have yet another opportunity to uncheck them here if I wanted to. And now I can finally click allow and cancel. So it struck me as very interesting because we're always trying to strike this balance between user experience and security. And, you know, you've probably seen some of the consent form attacks in the past. If you haven't, it was just, you know, people masquerading consent forms to look legitimate and getting you to assign broad permissions and taking advantage of that. So this definitely is on the far side of like maximizing. We want to make sure that you know what you're getting into. But it took, I don't know, 6 clicks to get to the final screen here. So I would imagine that there would be some that would say, you know, this is too many clicks to, you know, to integrate this application. But I thought it was interesting and worthy of discussion. And I thought it was a good flow personally to really kind of focus me and enumerate on the things that it was asking to be able to use.
Yeah, I think it was a really interesting example of because Google's like always been on the edge of pushing how to handle security around this stuff. And one of the interesting things about Google is that even their own first-party apps use OAuth and go through the same OAuth flow because their accounts team on accounts.google.com, they're the ones managing security around everything. So it's interesting to see what they're doing with this, and they're also obviously a huge target. So I use this example in talks I do of the Google Docs worm that went around a couple of years ago, and it was essentially tricking people into clicking yes on an OAuth screen by getting them to that through a roundabout way when they weren't really expecting to be tricked, and which is what phishing is. They've made a lot of changes since then to basically prevent that from ever happening again. And this is just the latest example of like making sure you actually know what you're getting into when you click that button. right? Like they want to make sure that that you're, what you're about to grant permission to. So I think it's really interesting. It's and that's a pretty significant change that they just rolled out.
Yeah. And this is the first time I saw it with draw.io, and it was a particularly good example because draw.io legitimately needs some broad permissions. They need to be able to save files to my Google Drive, and they within the draw.io app you can share diagrams that you've been working on. So it needs to like hook into the Google API in a lot of places. So in the past, I think you might just be inclined to click allow because I know I want to use draw.io, but this really made me pause for a moment and look at what it was asking for access to.
Yeah, definitely. Would this help with highlighting that an app is looking for offline access to your resources versus online? Yeah, I think it would. I believe if the app asks for offline access, which Google does include as a separate scope, it would probably have shown up in that list in some way. I don't know if it would have been we'll have to do some testing because I am curious. But yeah, like this is definitely like they want to make sure that you know what the app is requesting. So they're putting this information all out in front of you.
Yeah, one thing that's not clear to me yet, because this literally was, just a couple days ago that I encountered this, is, are there certain permissions that trigger this behavior? Is this the way it is for everything going forward? Is it configurable? I don't know yet.
Yep. I do know that Google, so one of the changes they rolled out after that Google phishing attack was this concept of sensitive scopes, I think they call it, where there's a couple of scopes highlighted in their docs, which require like special approval for apps to be able to use. So one of those is sending email. I think actually one of them is uploading files to your Google Drive. And so in order to use those sensitive scopes, the developer has to actually get the app like certified almost. It's like going through a security audit that's going to cost like $70,000 in order to be able to use those scopes at all. So I wonder if this is actually part of that. If like when an app does request sensitive scopes, it bumps it up into this like more detailed consent flow.
Right. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see because even for, some little app that I was making, I would be interested in, it would be nice if it was configurable. I would love to have that be the consent flow if I had a choice, even if it's not using terribly sensitive scopes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, interesting. Well, cool. Anything else on that topic? Otherwise, there's a question here I want to grab. So Paul has a question. We want to add third-party OAuth clients to FarmOS, a Drupal server. The problem is FarmOS, because it's Drupal, is self-hosted, so there's no central authority for third-party clients. How can we support third-party clients on self-hosted servers? This is a very good question, and this is actually something that I have spent a lot of time on. And you might remember back in the old OpenID days, before OpenID Connect, it was totally possible. So it wasn't OAuth, it wasn't getting an access token, but you could at least log into stuff. And the original OpenID was built that way. OpenID Connect threw all that out, just completely abandoned it, took OAuth as a foundation, and built on top of that instead. So now the interesting thing about OAuth is that it is a framework, not an actual not a protocol. It is a framework for building a protocol out of. And in practice, what's happened is you end up with very large OAuth providers like Google, Facebook, Instagram, all the commercial ones, and then you end up with like OAuth services like Okta or open source where you can run your own OAuth server. Those are all still centralized OAuth servers, even if you're running your own, right? And with this situation that you're talking about, where like someone comes and installs your Drupal app on a server, it's got an OAuth server built into it, I assume, and then that is its own OAuth server, and everyone who installs it sort of gets their own. So you end up with this like explosion of the number of OAuth servers, which are identity providers, and that means there isn't a registry of those. And then apps on top of that, this is where it starts becoming a problem. So if someone then builds like an iPhone app that's going to work with this particular open source software that's built into Drupal, that app developer can't go register client credentials, client ID on everybody's open source server, obviously, because there's an infinite number of them. You also don't want to tell the user that they have to like go into the site settings and create an OAuth client and put the keys into the app. That doesn't make sense either. You want them to just log in. So you have this problem of how do you handle this situation where there's n number of app developers and n number of OAuth providers and none of them know about each other, right? So you need to be able to sort of like bootstrap the app to tell it which OAuth server to use and also register for credentials or something like that. So OAuth does give you a way to do this. However, not very many people have actually done it this way. There's two parts to this answer. One, dynamic client registration is an extension that you could use for this purpose. I don't think that's the best option. The way that would work, though, is that you would get the user to download the app. You would have to ask the user to enter the server name of their Drupal instance. You would then use the combination of the discovery extension plus the dynamic client registration extension. That app would then go call the registration endpoint and get a client ID. At that point, it could also get a client secret because it's not a pre-registered secret, but it doesn't really matter. And then it can do an OAuth flow. I don't think it's not my favorite approach. The other way to handle this is to create a centralized registry of clients, which was what you mentioned in this question. So if there is no central authority for third-party clients, how do you handle that? What if there was a central registry for those third-party clients? And what if that registry was the web? What if that registry was that in order for somebody to build a third-party client, they have to have a website for that client that just talks about, like, here's this app, here's where you can download it. That website address could then be the client ID. And then there's no need to register anything in the server. So you don't need dynamic client registration because the client ID is the URL. So at this point, the way the login flow would work is you would ask them to type in the address of their server, and then it would just be able to start an OAuth flow immediately using the client ID as using the URL of the app, which is built into the app, as the client ID. So there's no registration step. You don't need a secret anyway because it's a mobile app. So you're going to be doing Pixie, which is fine, and that would then solve that problem of you don't need to register because the registration is the web. It's DNS. So and then the app would then do the regular OAuth flow, launch the in-app browser. They would see the Drupal page on their screen, log in there, and then the app gets an access token after that. So you can do that with OAuth, and you just have to decide that for your ecosystem, client IDs are URLs. So an example of this is Home Assistant has actually done exactly this, because Home Assistant has the same problem, where everybody's installing the Home Assistant software on their own servers, but then you've got the Home Assistant app or other apps that want to talk to that home automation software. So they went and did this as well, is they just say client IDs are URLs. The URL is where your in this case where the Home Assistant is running, and that's how you do an OAuth flow. The reason that I've been heavily involved in this is I also wrote an extension to OAuth that works this way. It takes it a few steps further as well, but it's the same problem where most of the time in this world that this extension lives in, we're talking about people are bringing their own WordPress websites or Drupal websites. Actually, now that I think about it, there's a plugin for you in Drupal already. It already exists. So you could just use that. But the people are bringing their WordPress sites, the Drupal sites, rolling their own static site generators just for making blogs, right? And then you want to be able to use an app to post to that blog that isn't your blog's built-in software. And so now we're back in that same problem of, well, how do you pre-register everything? And actually, just yesterday, a new app launched with support for this. The app IA Writer. It's like a Markdown editor, so it lets you write a post in Markdown in this very nice authoring interface, and then post it to your blog. And you do that by entering the URL to your blog, and then it does the OAuth flow with all these special rules about what user IDs are and what client IDs are, and then it's able to get an access token and post it. So that extension is called IndieAuth. The website's indieauth.net, and if you search for the Drupal plugin called IndieAuth, you'll find it. And that basically is a built-in OAuth server with the additional constraints of IndieAuth, which is client IDs are URLs, user IDs are also URLs, and a few other things as well. So that is a nice, easy way to start. So yeah, indieauth.net, link in the chat that you can click. So on that website, you'll probably find links to the Drupal plugin. If not, I should add them to that website. Yeah, so hopefully that helps. Gets you going. Cool. Oh, there was a question up at the top. We have a few more minutes left. Let's see if we can get to Dimitri's question. Imagine we develop a system like a mail service. Our UI is in JavaScript, so it's a public client. It has functionality like sending, viewing emails. So there are two scopes. For other clients, we allow only the view email scope. So anyone can use our public client to authorize their app. It means that using some tricks, we can send email on behalf of a victim. I'm not quite following the question here. You might have to rephrase this. So Micah, do you understand the question here?
I'm rereading the first part of it.
Yeah. So I think I see where this is going. So yeah, with public clients, there's no client secret, which means anybody can impersonate that public client. This is something that's actually almost impossible to solve. So yeah, if you have a public client, that client ID is public, which means somebody else can come along and use that client ID in an OAuth app and do an exchange. In order for that to work, they have to be able to also control the redirect URL, which is difficult but not impossible, especially if you're only trying to attack your own account on your own machine. You can very easily intercept the redirect URL, which means someone could, yeah, I see now. Now I see that. Now I understand the question that you're asking. So yeah, if you give your client ID special privileges, someone could use that client ID to complete the flow. And if they're doing it on their own machine for their own account, they would be able to complete the flow and get an access token, which would then let them do things that the privileged client could do that other clients can't. Now, attacking your own account is sometimes interesting, but oftentimes not. This is an example that happened to Twitter, where the Twitter apps themselves have different criteria around rate limits or like which APIs they can access. So you might be able to do things like get around rate limits by doing that. But actually attacking somebody else's account, you have to be able to control the redirect URL on their computer. So there's multiple ways to do that. There's poisoning their DNS, getting them to install a browser extension, things like that. It is harder, but that is one of the risks of public clients in general. Yeah.
And we've had questions in the workshops that we do, like suppose our DNS has been compromised. Well, you have bigger problems than OAuth if your DNS has been compromised. But it's kind of, if that's the case, it's kind of like game over. So we
there's only so much that you can do well. I guess it's like if someone can poison your DNS, they probably have higher value targets than just tricking the OAuth flow, right? So it's like when you lock up your bike on a rack full of bikes, you don't need the most secure lock. You just need a better lock than the next bike.
Yeah.
Right.
And
so
I will say
even though
that,
someone could cut through your lock, they're not going to because there's an easier lock next to yours.
right, exactly. And I think kind of to that point, I think a big overlooked vector of attack are browser extensions. They're so easy to get approved on the stores, and they're so easy to install, and they can have very broad permissions, and it's kind of like back to the old consent form problem. Like, I think people don't pay a lot of attention to the permissions that their browser extensions are asking for. And a browser extension could have complete control of your browser. It could intercept incoming and outgoing URLs and alter them and change them. And there are, legitimate uses for those, but it's low hanging fruit, compared to, say, poisoning DNS or compromising DNS, like for a whole company or something. Getting a browser extension in the door is probably that cheaper bike lock.
Yep. Well, yeah, this has been a fun conversation. Hopefully, giving you some things to think about. Any closing remarks?
No, I hope to see everybody again next week. I'm glad we're doing this. It's been fun and illuminating for me. I hope it has been for you too.
Yeah, definitely. It's been a lot of fun. Thanks everybody for joining. If we didn't get to your question, come back next week. We'll do this again. And yeah, hope to see everybody again next time. Thanks so much for joining.